Today I will present you our paper about a mixed method study on user experiences and challenges of recovery codes for an end-to-end encrypted service. That's quite a long title. And before I start, I want to thank my awesome colleagues and supervisors for helping me with this work. So let's start. Accounts are most often protected with a password and additionally sometimes with a two-factor authentication code. And additionally, services need some kind of fallback if users lose these primary login credentials. And widespread recovery options are something like email recovery, SMS recovery, or also security questions. But previous research found attack vectors against all of those methods. And also if a service is end-to-end encrypted, like some secure mail services, we see here Proton Mail or Tutao, or messengers like Signal or password managers, they don't have access to the user account or the data, and they're thus not able to manipulate the account and let the user back in. So there has to exist a solution where the user has some kind of backup option that they can use without the intervention of the service, as elsewise they might be locked out permanently in case they lose their password or their 2FA code. And this is where recovery codes come into play as a possible solution. They're regarded as a secure option, and that user can get and have to store as a fallback for the password, or more often, if they lose their 2FA token. These recovery codes are quite convenient, as the service does not need access to the user account, and the user can initiate the recovery themselves. The codes are most often quite unwieldy. On the bottom of the slide, we see such a recovery code consisting of 16 words with each 4 characters. But the recovery code places many demands on the users. First, the user have to know about the recovery code. They then have to save it correctly to a hopefully secure location. And later, if they have to do the recovery, they have to find the code again. We found no previous research on the question how users handle the recovery code and what obstacles they face. Therefore, we formulated 3 research questions. First, are users aware of the existence and the importance of recovery code? Second, what strategies do they have for handling the recovery code and storing it? And third, what obstacles do they face with the recovery code? Gladly for our work, we could get help of the email provider Tutao, or formerly known Tutao, and investigate their user base and the handling of the recovery code as a case study. Tutao is a secure end-to-end encrypted email provider catered towards security-affine users. It has more than 10 million users by now. They deploy recovery codes as the only option in case of password loss, or if activated also in case of 2FA loss. To investigate our research questions, we did 2 things. First, we did a survey with the Tutao users that was appended to the monthly newsletters that they sent to their user base. And secondly, we analyzed posts on the Tutao subreddit regarding account recovery and recovery codes. So let's start with the survey. 281 users responded to our survey. And we asked them different kind of questions, like their service usage, their subscription status, or their 2FA usage. Regarding the recovery code, we inquired the user awareness of the code, the strategies to store the code, experience and opinions that they had with the recovery code. And in this talk, we will mainly focus on the user awareness of the recovery codes and their strategies for handling the code. Regarding the user awareness, our first question was open-ended without hinting for the recovery code, and instead we asked what the participants would do if they lose their password. And as you can see, about half of our participants named the recovery code on their own initiative. Other participants stated that they would use a password manager, either indicating that the password loss was unlikely or that the password was backed up there. And a few also mentioned password backup outside of the password manager. For example, they wrote it down. Measures only taken after the loss of a password were also mentioned. Some participants hoped that the support could help them. They would click on the forget password interface or search for website instructions. And critically, if they have not saved the recovery code before, neither of these options could help them to get back into their account, and they would be locked out permanently. Interestingly, a few participants also talked about security questions, which we can see here in the other category, or about backup emails. And these 2 options are not available for Tutao. We see this as some kind of indication that users are accustomed to common mechanisms from other websites. And then they have expectation, and these expectations can actually superimpose on the mechanisms they were presented with or they actually set up. Our next question was directly asking for the recovery code. And when we showed them the code and asked them, do you know about the code? About 81% of our users were aware that such a recovery code existed. But 9% were not aware, and another 9% were not sure about it. And again, I think these are quite critical numbers. At about 18% of the participants would be locked out permanently in case they lose their primary login credentials. But what about the users that know about the recovery code? How do they store it? We asked the 289 participants that were aware of the recovery code how the strategies were for saving it. And as a disclaimer, we didn't think or find any method that we unconditionally regarded as the best or most secure storage option, as they all have their advantages or disadvantages and are dependent on the individual threat model. But let's discuss the two most frequent storage options. And first, this was participants storing their recovery code in a password manager. We assume that the password manager is a secure place that is encrypted and protects the recovery code against most unauthorized access. But also, maybe the availability must be viewed in a different manner, because the recovery code is stored alongside the password. If users lose access to their password, they most likely will also lose access to the recovery code, the one thing that would help them get back into their account. And also, if 2FA is activated, an adversary that had access to the password manager does not need the second factor, as the recovery code can circumvent 2FA. Another prominent method was to store the code offline, like writing it down or printing the recovery code. And on one hand, this is a nice strategy, as it can protect the recovery code against dangerous attacks or digital adversaries. On the other hand, users might be vulnerable to close relatives or physical threats. That's how we like to talk about users sticking the password to the desktop or like writing it under their keyboard. But as users don't use the recovery code as often as a password, they also must be organized to find the location of the recovery code after a long time. And if they make mistakes while writing down the code, they might destroy the only fallback option that they have. Also, when they enter the code, they might make typos, which could lead to a frustrating recovery process. Now that we've talked about some advantages or disadvantages for individual strategies, what happens if it doesn't work out? So what are the problems users face when using a recovery code? To investigate this question, we will come to the second part of our study. Until now, we've seen the survey that was sent out to the Tutao newsletters. That means most likely users that answered our survey were participants that never had to recover their account or for whom recovery worked out, as otherwise they would have lost their account and would be less likely to register again and answer our survey. This is why we call it the official Tutao subreddit, looking for posts that were connected with recovery codes and account recovery as an additional mean. As Tutao only offers customer support for paying users, the subreddit is a valid way, especially for free users, to ask questions. After some data cleaning, we found 196 threads relevant for account recovery or recovery codes, which we qualitatively analyzed with precoders. We found three main themes. First, threads in which user had problems with their login. Second, user opinions about the recovery code. For example, users ranting that the recovery code is insecure. And third, users' question about the recovery code and its functionalities. And for some threads, these themes could also co-occur. Because of time reason, we will mainly look at the login problems and support requests of the users. So on this slide, we can see all the threads that are connected to problems with login credentials. We can see that for 48 users lost their recovery code and 53 users lost their password. And critically, both events co-occurred 37 times, meaning permanent account loss. That gave mostly no information why the users lost their credentials, but a few elaborated on data loss because of a factory reset, and also 2 users had problem to access their password managers, showing that this might be a rare but realistic scenario. When they could not get access to their accounts or find their login credentials, a few users elaborated on sending some kind of proof that the account belongs to them to Tutao, so they hoped that they would let them back in. Interestingly, what we also found in 31 threads were users that still had their recovery code, but asked for help and it was not functioning for them. For most users, we can only assume what the problems were, but 2 were confused with the white spaces in the code, and 1 user confused the letter L with a 1. For the others, we believe that they entered the recovery code wrongly or wrote it down wrongly, but some users indicated that they were sure about its correctness. And of course, this also led to negative sentiments towards the service. As we see here from one Reddit users, why would they provide me with a recovery phrase to keep safe that doesn't work? In the same vein, we found other occasions in which the recovery code did not help, but was also not designed to help. We found several users that could not access the account after creation, most likely because they ran into spam protection or they went against tutor's terms of services, or other users that had their account disabled per tutor's policy as they had only a free account that was inactive for more than 6 months. Especially for the first case, users tried to enter their recovery code unsuccessfully, but also for the later case, some users did not understand that the recovery code would not help them to get back into their account. And this misconception is somehow to be expected, as it's not in the name of the recovery code that there are some restrictions on when recovery is possible and when not. And users are also not made aware why their account is gone. Also, previous research found that actual implementation for recovery codes could differ, and also if services let the users in after loss of recovery code or not. We therefore conclude that for at least some users, it's opaque whether the recovery code can work or actually not, and when they can use the recovery code and not. And before I end my talk, I want to stress that our participants were most likely an upper bound. As we queried users of the service tutor, we most likely got quite security-affine users, and they might be representative for people deliberately using an end-to-end encrypted service, but probably not so much for normal users caring less for security. But these normal users might also get in touch with recovery codes, for example, if they set up 2FA. We expect such users to be even less aware of recovery codes and deploy other strategies more often, for example, taking a picture of the recovery code. And still, for our sample, we found that only 81% of the participants really were aware of the recovery code, and some still had misconceptions and did not understand that the recovery code is the only option they have for account recovery. And some were hoping that the service would let them in, and they are only dependent on its generosity. With this, I want to end my talk. Thank you for being with me for the last talk. Are there any questions?